Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar series on managing drought in the Southern Plains. I'm Mark Schaefer with the Oklahoma Climate Survey and Southern Climate Impacts Planning Program. I will be the moderator for today's webinar. We will be joined by Brian Fuchs from the National Drought Mitigation Center, Amy Roeder with USDA Risk Management Agency, Derrell Peel with Oklahoma State University Extension, Manny Encinias with New Mexico State University Extension, and Eldon White with the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. Margaret Boone, SCIP Program Manager, is managing the webinar. In addition to the presenters, several state climatologists are on the line, including Barry Keim from Louisiana, Dave Dubois from New Mexico, John Nielsen Gammon from Texas, and Gary McManus and Renee McPherson from Oklahoma, and Mary Knapp from Kansas. We invite questions to the state climatologists as well as today's presenters. I would also like to recognize the support of those who made this webinar series possible. Chad McNutt with the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, David Brown with NOAA Regional Climate Services Director for the Southern Region, and Mike Hayes with the National Drought Mitigation Center. These webinars are an ongoing series that will occur on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. Because of the holidays, we will not hold a webinar on December 22nd. Our next webinar will be held on January 12th. These webinars are designed to improve communication across our region to help those agencies and organizations that are managing aspects of the drought. Your interests and needs are important to us. We encourage you to help us select presentation topics either through the online poll that you see on your screen, through the chat box, or by emailing or calling SCIP. Each webinar includes an update from the Drought Monitor authors and state climatologists. Each will have a discussion topic based on the topics of greatest interest, as indicated by the poll, subject to the availability of presenters. We welcome suggestions on presenters as well as topics. So if you know people that you think would be really good for any of these topics, please get them in touch with us or send us suggestions. You may ask questions or make comments at any time through typing in your chat box. Each webinar is recorded and posted on the SCIP YouTube channel. The PowerPoint slides are posted on the NIDIS Drought portal, drought.gov, in the Southern Plains section. A two-page summary, PDF summary, will be prepared following the webinar and will be available next week on the NIDIS portal, SCIP website, and SCIP Facebook page. We will put up a list of resources, including these links, again at the end of the presentation. Before beginning, I would like to mention that we will be distributing a short survey to gather comments and ideas on how we can continue to improve these webinars and ensure that they are useful to you. When you receive the email, please complete the survey at your earliest convenience so we can incorporate any changes needed as soon as possible. I will now turn it over to our first presenter, Brian Fuchs, climatologist from the National Drought Mitigation Center, for an overview of drought conditions and outlook. He will be followed by our cattle impacts topic presenters, Amy Roeder, Risk Management Specialist at USDA's Risk Management Agency, Derrell Peel, Breedlove Professor of Agribusiness and Extension Livestock Marketing Specialist at Oklahoma State University, Manny Encinias, Associate Professor and Extension Beef Cattle Specialist at New Mexico State University, Clayton Livestock Research Center, and Eldon White, Executive Director of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. Barry Keim, Louisiana State climatologist, will then have some updates on the drought in Louisiana. So we'll go on to Brian now. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As Mark stated, I'm Brian Fuchs, a climatologist here at the National Drought Mitigation Center and one of the U.S. Drought Monitor authors. And I'll start in with the update. So on the next slide, we see the map that was released this morning of the current U.S. Drought Monitor conditions. We can see there were some changes, again, some improvements in the areas that we've been seeing rain over the last several weeks. I've been looking at some of the precipitation statistics, and it looks like portions of eastern Oklahoma and into northeast Texas and Arkansas in the last 60 days or so, they're a good 6 to 8 inches above normal in a broad portion of the region, and this is where we've seen a lot of the improvement over the last several weeks. We're still seeing good portions of Texas being impacted by the drought. And again, in the southeast, there's a good chunk of Georgia into Alabama and creeping into the Carolinas where drought is further intensifying. Next slide. This week we can see the southern U.S. region as a whole, and we can see at this time there's about 23% of the region in D4 drought. That compares to 28% last week, and 3 months ago it was 52%. So we do see this dent in the drought in this region with the rains that we've experienced over the last 90 days or so. If we look at the D1 through D4 conditions, currently we're about 81%. 3 months ago we were at 89%. So the overall depiction of areas that were in drought that are now currently drought-free has decreased by about 9% for the region. Compared to a year ago, where we only had about 38% of the region in any kind of drought. So we can really see the rapid swing that we had going into drought, and as typical with most instances, we're seeing that the drought is slow to improve. Again, drought is typically characterized as slow onset and slow recovery. As we go to the next slide, we look at the outlook here for the next 5 days. Right now in the upper right-hand corner, we're seeing that a little bit of precipitation chances all the way through the central U.S., all the way from the Great Lakes down into South Texas, some precipitation moving into the southwestern United States and also on the extreme southeastern U.S. on the Gulf Coast, the Atlantic Coast. As we see these precipitation chances move through, the thing that stands out this week is, for the most part, the amounts are fairly light. So even though the precipitation would be welcomed over the next 5 days or so, we're not looking at any substantial amounts in any of the regions. Looking at temperature forecast in the lower left, most of the country here from the Pacific Northwest through the southern plains, we're looking at temperatures that are going to be below normal for this time of year. But then in the northern tier of the country and into the Great Lakes region, temperatures are looking to be above normal during this time frame. Next slide. For the more extended outlook, 8 to 14 days, we're seeing with the temperature outlook in the upper left, where temperatures are expected to be above normal through much of the Midwest, into and including the Mississippi River Valley and the Ohio River Valley into the Great Lakes. And then we have this trough that's going to be digging into the western U.S., and associated with that is some cold air that's going to be coming in from the north, and thus we see temperatures are expected to be below normal for much of the Great Basin into the desert southwest, and including pretty much all of Arizona and New Mexico. Again, precipitation outlooks in the extended, fairly dry through much of the western U.S., including California, down into New Mexico, and also the Florida Peninsula. And as we move into the Midwest and the Southern Plains, we're seeing some chances for above normal precipitation. And again, this is the region that we've seen the most active precipitation pattern that's been established now for the last 2 to 3 months. So it looks like that has a good opportunity to continue through that same region. Next slide. For the seasonal outlooks, we'll start with December. We're looking like the best chances of precipitation are going to continue to be in the same area in the upper right-hand portion of this slide that we've seen improvement through eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, through Arkansas, Missouri, into Illinois. This area has established itself as the more active portion of the weather pattern over the U.S. over the last several months. And we're seeing some chances of above normal precipitation in the Pacific Northwest. Temperatures look to be below normal in the western U.S. and above normal from Texas all the way up through the mid-Atlantic states, including the southeastern U.S. The bottom two graphics on this frame are showing the seasonal forecast. And again, this is a typical La Nina pattern with above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation expected through this region. So it looks like over the last several months we have had some improvement to some of our drought regions in the southern plains, but it's still looking like a favorable forecast going forward for La Nina conditions to establish themselves. And so at any moment, I would not see it unusual for this pattern to change and change abruptly. Next slide. Here's the seasonal drought outlook that CPC has put out. And again, it's highlighting that area of eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, northern Louisiana, where we have seen improvements over the last several months, and we're going to continue to see this area having the best chances of precipitation in the extended period. We see drought development through the Florida Peninsula and into the Carolinas, and drought persisting through much of Texas and western Oklahoma, southwest Kansas and eastern New Mexico and into Colorado. And in the upper Midwest, including the Central Plains as well. The drought regions that were established over the last several months with the dry fall period that we've seen, we do have some persistence of that drought, but in areas we do see some opportunities for some improvement as we move into the winter months. And next slide, I think that is my last slide on the update and the outlook. And just a featured product again this week. Did you know that the National Drought Mitigation Center has worked with rangeland experts to assist ranchers in developing ranch plans for their operations during drought? And this is part of the NDMC website, and it's called Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch, and the URL is given. I'm going to have a couple screenshots on the next several slides trying to explain what we're trying to do with this and what ranchers can do to utilize this tool in their planning process. So next slide. This is the main page for the Managing Drought Risk on the Ranch website at the NDMC. And across the top, you can see that there's an overview, there's drought basics, there's an inventory and monitoring tab, what to do before a drought, what to do during a drought, what to do after a drought. And then we're also going to give you examples on how you can write a drought plan that's specific to your ranch operation. And on this front page here, you can see that we have examples from different parts of the country where ranches have drought plans in place, and they have triggers in those plans on what to do when they're coming in a drought and coming out of a drought, with several examples given. Next slide. On the drought basics, what we're really helping producers do with this tool is have some understanding on their grasses in drought, what type of grasses are being impacted, how are they being impacted, grazing patterns during drought, the financial considerations of destocking, of working your ranch, buying hay on the open market, etc. Planning, how do you get this plan established? How do I know what to do? Weather and drought, just some ideas on how to monitor drought on your ranch. And then again, how is your livestock being impacted by this drought? What can be done to improve the health of the animals on the ranch? Next slide. The last part of this page is that Write a Plan tab. And we have a step-by-step process. We show the 7 steps here. Each one is based on previous experience and work with experts in this field. And then on the right-hand side, you can see there are some sample drought plans for different states, all the way from Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and Texas. And these are from working operations that are currently existing, that these ranch managers have went out and established a working plan for their ranch. And what we encourage producers to do is to go into these different plans, see what they can do with them, what works for them, and establish a ranch plan for their operation. And with that, I think that is my last slide. And again, my contact information and my email is up there. If you'd like to ask further questions or know more about the ranch plan tool that we host, please let me know and I'll be in touch. Thank you.
Hello, Amy. We'll now go with our into the topic presentation. So beginning with Amy Roeder from USDA.
Good morning, everybody. I'm with the Risk Management Agency. We're under USDA, Department of Ag. We are truly a public and private agency. We administer crop insurance programs that are sold through the private industry. Next slide. I'm going to quickly go through a few of these slides, and are just a lot of them are in here just for your use and to review later. I guess as a little bit of background on why we have the pasture rangeland and forage program, which ensures producers for losses in their pasture, rangeland, or hay production, is to protect them against things like drought. Congress mandated actually in the statute that was one of our highest priorities, that the Risk Management Agency come up with products. We ended up coming up with a rainfall index and a vegetation index that uses remote sensing technology. One of the things that we try to be very clear on is that we don't consider either one of these drought insurance. One is the lack of rainfall, and one is strictly based on biomass. Now, obviously, drought is a cause of loss, but it's possible to have a drought as you do in Texas, but if you get rainfall within a period of time that's normal, you may not get a trigger of payment. However, you're still in a drought. So that's why we're very careful not to say that it's drought insurance. Next slide. There were significant challenges in trying to come up with a crop insurance program to cover pasture arrangement and forage. And one of the things, since we are a national organization, we've got to come up with a product that insures north, in South Texas, as well as North Dakota, East Coast and West Coast. And this isn't a crop that's corn. Corn is corn everywhere. There are various forage species depending on the region. Next slide. This is a pilot program, and what's unusual for a pilot program, normally pilot programs are just in a few states or even a few counties to begin with. This product has been very popular, and with congressional urging, we have expanded this pilot. The blue states reflect the states that are underneath our rainfall index, pasture arrangement forage program, and the green states show those that are under the remote sensing program. Again, this is a very large pilot area for a risk management agency. Next slide. To be clear, before we get into the specifics, these are area plans of insurance. They don't insure my specific pasture. They are area-based. That said, that means that there's no loss adjustment records for producers to maintain, and it does allow a risk management agency to release the results so companies can make payments very timely, which then allows producers to purchase hay and other feed for their livestock. Next slide. I talk about time frames quite a bit as we go through this, and we went with index intervals, and the rainfall index has 2 months, the vegetation index has 3-month time intervals, and that allows producers, based on their specific grazing practices and forage species, to select the time periods that are most important for their forage production. Obviously, again, South Texas would be quite different than North Dakota versus Maine. So that just allows for a lot of flexibility in the program based on region. Next slide. Going to cover just briefly the two programs. One is the vegetation index, and that's essentially 8-kilometer grids versus insuring the whole county. And again, it uses the remote sensing normalized difference vegetation index, and it's a deviation from normal products. So it's from 1989 to 2009, what was normal over that time period, and then how does this year, 2011, compare to the normal. And we do have tools available that are at the end of this presentation that we'll fly through, that any producer or anybody can go out to our website and review. One thing that is critical and that we've run into is that because these are 3-month time periods, it probably is not appropriate to insure winter months when you don't have any growth. It's important for everybody to ensure their critical growing season, and the peak of the growing season when the saturation is found is probably most important. Next slide. Under the vegetation program, up to 10 3-month index intervals are offered, and producers have to select at least one interval, but they can select more than one. And what we're talking about is a 3-month interval would be January, February, March, April, etc., clear through the year. And again, it allows them to customize this program to their needs. And it also, when you look at a 3-month time period versus an annual, it allows you to get a better reaction and also to release payments when at the time when they're needed. Next slide. This is an example of a county in Texas with a vegetation index grid overlaid on it. Now, we're not in Texas with a vegetation index program, but this is just here for a reference. Next slide. This is an example of a daily calculation in New Mexico, and you'll see that the beginning of the year, the blue line is indication of the lowest NDVI reading in the historical, and the green line indicates the highest maximum NDVI reading. And you'll notice that there was a large carryover of biomass in 2010, and the red line actually is for the 2010-11 year through June, or actually August. But you'll see that the red line actually created the highest NDVI reading because of the high biomass carryover. But then you'll see as the drought started impacting New Mexico and affecting the 2011 growth, the red line goes down and then establishes the lowest NDVI level. So that's just an example to show you what the readings were in New Mexico that we saw this year, and they were dramatic, and we actually paid out very high losses in the summer months. Next slide. Rainfall Index Program. It's an area-based plan that uses NOAA Climate Prediction Center daily precipitation data. It's on a 0.25 degree grid, and it's a deviation from normal, and this goes back to 1948. So next slide. Again, we offer 11 two-month index intervals, and that would be January, February, March, through to the end. And under this program, producers have to select at least two two-month periods, but they can select up to 6. And with the exception of that is California, that due to the in some of the desert areas, we only allow months where the monsoons are to be insured. Next slide. And this is the same county in Texas with a grid overlay for the rainfall index to kind of demonstrate the difference of the sizes of the grid. Next slide. We have a lot of information out on ranchers that we get a lot of feedback of some issues that they don't quite understand the program. So RMA recognizes that there is an education challenge out there. We do all we can do, including topics like this, in order to try to educate. However, it is the private industry's responsibility to be the main educator, the agents, the actual crop insurance agents, and the companies behind those agents. Next slide. Where are we today? I said under the vegetation index, we have 10 index intervals. In many states to the north, such as South Dakota, we don't offer 10 index intervals because many of those intervals are under snow. They may only have 5 intervals or even 4 intervals. So it does vary across the region. We have significant drought conditions in New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, with catastrophic impacts to the industry as a whole. We've released 7 intervals under the vegetation index. We've released 8 under the rainfall index. We have paid significant losses in both of these programs, which hopefully are helping producers purchase hay and feed for their livestock and to mitigate some of the losses that they're suffering. It's been absolutely amazing. And next slide. These are the losses that we've paid to date in just a few select states. For vegetation, you'll see the total indemnities paid is $4 million, and you'll notice that in states like New Mexico, we've spent over almost a little over $3.7 million, and that's with more results. That isn't the full year. You'll notice that Risk Management Agency does subsidize premiums, and if you assume that the government pays 50% of the premium amounts that you see are the total premium. That includes the government subsidy and producer paid. So in places like New Mexico, we're paying over 2 times the money, and that's how you come up with your loss ratio on the side. Now you'll see states that did not have the drought, such as South Dakota and Nebraska, that received a lot of rainfall. There's very little indemnities that's been paid, and those were probably likely along rivers where they had floods. Next slide, please. These are the rainfall index estimated losses to date, and the significant counties, or excuse me, states here are Texas and Oklahoma. Now, Kansas, the southern part of Kansas, we've paid tremendous losses. The reason the loss ratio isn't higher in Kansas is when you get to the northern half of the state, they've had some pretty good rainfall, and we've not had the losses there. Texas, you'll see we've had paid out over 132 million in indemnities, and obviously we still have several indemnities yet. Next slide, please. Again, the New Mexico results, I further showed this, how the first part of the year we weren't paying any indemnities. However, you get to the July through September period, we're paying, we had a 6% or over 6 loss and an over 5 point loss, which means that for every dollar premium, $6 were paid in indemnities, or $5.26 in the next period. We anticipate that the losses in August through October will be significant also. Next slide, please. Texas results are illustrated here. Again, as the year progressed, higher indemnities were paid. You'll notice, for instance, July, August had 25 million, and then August, September had 5 million. But you'll see that when you look at the percentage by acreage, that more acreage is in that. So that's why those amounts go up and down. You'll see most people put January, February, March, April. They can't overlap periods. So it shows our participation where producers are putting their money. Next slide, please. Oklahoma results are also shown, and you'll see that June, July, we had a 4.86 loss ratio. Again, significant losses. The participation in Oklahoma isn't quite as high as Texas. However, we are noticing that it appears for 2012 our sign-up in those states is significantly different. The next slide shows the Kansas results, and I know they're going to be posting these on the web, so I'm not going to cover those. Anyone who's got an interest can move through those. The next slide is our copy of our homepage. It's the rma.usda.gov website. And I talked a little bit about the tools that are available, and under the quick links, and we have the box showing where you can go to get more information and to look at these products. And you'll see the rainfall and vegetation indices if you select that. And then the next slide shows you the page that will come up. And, under the rainfall index or vegetation index, depending on which state you're in or what your interest is, you collect or close to pasture, rangeland, forage, which brings you up to the next slide, shows the Google map, and you can type in the town nearest your ranch, and that will zoom you in with a little dot there. And the next slide shows how you can zoom in and get that map where it's, I prefer this hybrid view, and you can actually zoom it down to where you can see houses, fields, and stuff, and a producer finds his location with that. Once a location is found, you'll notice on the left-hand side of the screen a decision support tool and historical, in this case, vegetation, because it's a New Mexico location. You can select those, and then it will automatically fill in the information, which is shown on the next slide. An example, and the previous slide showed New Mexico. We were on Guadalupe County, and this has all the historical information for every year back to 1989 for each time period, what the deviation from normal was. So you can see if I had a year exactly like 2002, what would the results have been? And it shows you what those were. This also has the ability, and I don't have a slide on it, but you can actually graph this out on a model, and you'll see the graph function on the left lower hand corner. Now, obviously, the graph's going to be pretty busy if you leave all those checks, so we always suggest that you uncheck some of those boxes, and then it will actually graph out the results for you. The next slide shows you the historical indices tool, and this isn't completed, but you essentially fill it out, whether it's grazing or hazing, hayland, what your different factors are, and the year you want to look at, back to 1989 in this case, or 1948 if it's rainfall, and it will actually show you what you would have been paid or not paid and how much it would have cost you. The next slide has my contact information. I'm always happy to answer any questions or provide any information. Thanks.
Okay, next up is Derrell Peel talking about the impacts here in Oklahoma.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to have a chance to visit with you a little bit about some of the market impacts and the drought impacts on Oklahoma and the surrounding region. Next slide, please. Before I get into the drought impacts per se, I want to take just a minute and give you a bit of background about the market situation. It's important in that the market situation that the beef industry is in right now is rather unique, unprecedented, and that has an impact on the nature of the impacts to producers that were affected by the drought. On the other hand, the drought itself has an impact on the market situation. So it's really a two-way impact here that's going on, and there are many market factors affecting the cattle market right now, as there usually are. But the two most salient points with respect to the drought, I think, are the fact that we are essentially in a period of record high cattle prices at this point in time. And that certainly has had impacts in that, for the most part, as we will see, when producers were forced to liquidate cattle, the one salvation if they're in the drought this year in the region was that the price impacts were much less severe than they would normally be for a drought of this magnitude. And again, it's due to that underlying market situation. The other part of it that's certainly related to that is the fact that cattle inventories are at essentially 50-year low levels, depending on exactly which class of cattle you look at. And so you can see that. In fact, if we go to the next slide, you'll see that as of January 1, 2011, we had just under 93 million head of cattle total estimated in the U.S. The last time we had a number lower than that was in 1958. And so you can see that certainly over the last, well, really for many years, the industry has gotten a little smaller in terms of cattle numbers, but particularly over the last 15 years or so, cattle numbers have continued to decline. And that has set the stage for this unique market environment we're in. And so some of the impacts and some of the things going on in the cattle industry are the drought plays into them. It has an impact on them, but many of these are impacts that were and market features that were already in place before the drought comes along. Next slide, please. You can look specifically here at on two different scales here. The beef cow herd specifically nationally is the red line graphed on the right-hand scale. Oklahoma specifically on the left-hand scale. And what you see, a couple things again, in Oklahoma, our cattle numbers had actually trended up over the last 15 to 20 years, particularly in the last decade or so as the national herd continued to decline. Oklahoma was actually increasing, but I have put on the very right-hand side my estimate at this point in time for where I think the USDA might estimate that we are as of January 1, 2012. And my estimate for the cow herd per se in Oklahoma is that we have probably lost in the neighborhood of 12% of our beef cow herd in 1 year's time, from January 1 to January 1. And so you see that as a very, very sharp, unprecedented decrease from a 1 year standpoint. I do know that some of the estimates for Texas are similar in magnitude in terms of percentage changes, and certainly that would be true in some of the surrounding regions as well. Also included in here, because of that it's my expectation that the national beef cow herd decreased this year. Estimates range anywhere from a minimum of 2% up to as much as perhaps 3.5%. And again, an indication that the drought in this region was severe enough, and there's enough of the industry located here in terms of the number of beef cows here that despite the fact that we have actually been attempting to expand the beef cow herd, this year and even last year in northern regions, principally in the country, The impact of the drought this year was more than sufficient to preempt on a national basis any increase in the cow herd and will cause and will result in additional liquidation of the beef cow herd. Next slide, please. You know, the other side of that inventory number situation is high prices, and just very quickly, I've plotted for Oklahoma City markets 2 different feeder cattle price series, both of which show that, you know, at current market levels, we're at very close to record levels, or essentially operating at record levels. You know, calf prices dropped in Oklahoma, for example, a little bit during the middle of the summer, but at their lowest point, at no time did they actually drop below year-ago levels. Same thing was true of cull cow prices and other things. So despite the unprecedented magnitude of animals that we did move through markets as a result of the drought this year, all in all, we managed to maintain value and therefore maintain equity for some of our producers better than one would have ever anticipated for a drought of this magnitude. Next slide, please. So far what we've seen is significant cattle liquidation in the region. You know, obviously due primarily to lack of pasture and hay production, but also notably in this part of the region, we do rely very heavily on surface water, and so lack of available water in our stock ponds and so on was a significant problem. Producers that have managed to hang on to cattle and have decided, in some cases, to try to hang on to cattle through the drought have purchased enormous amounts of feed. We continue to see a lot of feed purchases being made. These producers are obviously incurring additional costs, and that will have financial implications for these down the road. And again, as I said, you know, what has happened in this region was more than sufficient to preempt a national tendency, given record price levels for the beef cow herd to at least stop liquidating this year and begin expanding. Now the drought has postponed that until some point in the future. So next slide, please. If we look at where we are right now in terms of getting through the winter, you know, most producers are getting by with probably minimal feed supplies. They've purchased feeds. They're hoping they have enough in many cases. We're utilizing a wide variety of feed resources, including feeds that we normally do not use. And so in many cases, there's going to be additional management challenges. Producers are utilizing, you know, relatively unfamiliar feedstuffs. There's a lot of variation in quantity and quality of these feedstuffs. Particularly as time goes on, it's even obvious just almost on a casual observation as you look at the truckloads of hay coming into the state. You can see a noticeable decrease in the quality of that hay in many cases as you look at the continued movement of that forage into the region. For some producers, probably the biggest challenge in terms of being able to continue their plans of trying to hang on to cows through the winter will be an issue of water. That depends on where you are. The rains we've had recently in some parts of the state have replenished some water supplies, but there are other regions where water continues to decrease, and that may be ultimately the limiting factor that forces some additional movement. And I didn't put it on here, I forgot, but the month of November was remarkably good in terms of conditions, particularly for winter wheat pasture. We were very dry even through the end of October, with very little prospects apparent at that time for appreciable winter forage. We do rely heavily on that here in the Southern Plains, but the month of November probably could not have been more ideal in terms of wheat pasture growth, and so we do in fact find ourselves now with significant amounts of wheat pasture available. That's going to be used primarily, I think, in many cases to supplement those minimal feed supplies that producers have to sort of hang on to the cattle they already have. There are some producers who are now engaged in bringing in some of their normal level of stocker cattle that we typically bring in. Oklahoma is normally a very big importing state of cattle at this time of the year, and we expected very little. We'll see some of that happen now, but I think still in terms of the actual cattle imports compared to normal, we'll be well below normal for this point in time. But the wheat forage is going to provide very critical relief for a number of producers. It's going to be a challenge for producers to maintain cows in good shape through the winter, through calving season, and particularly in terms of their ability to maintain reproductive performance next year in terms of rebreeding. And that, I think, is the biggest risk that producers take when they try to carry animals through a drought, breeding animals in particular, is that there's a real danger that if you're not careful with nutritional management of these animals, that you can simply postpone the cost of the drought to some later date in terms of reduced productivity. And that, I think, will be a real issue that we'll be watching very carefully as we go forward. Next slide, please. You know, we don't know what's going to happen yet in terms of whether the drought continues or whether or not we have something more normal next year. If the drought continues, it's going to depend on sort of what kind of drought it is. What made 2011 was such a devastating year from the standpoint of cattle and forage production was the fact that we simply had no spring. We had no early growth at all. And so very quickly in the first half of the year, you lose your forage production for the whole year, and that's essentially what has happened to us. If that happens again next year in 2012, if we have a dry spring and significantly do not produce our normal both pasture and hay production in the early part of the year, then I think we will see additional liquidation, despite the fact that we've moved enormous numbers of cattle and cows in particular out of the region through the drought this year. There's still an awful lot of cows in the country, and for many producers, the impacts would happen much quicker if we have another dry spring. This year, most of the liquidation kicked in really after the 4th of July. Next year, I think, if we're still dry by April, into that April time period, we'll see additional liquidation happen much more quickly this year, simply because we're just that much tighter on feed resources, and more importantly, perhaps tighter on financial resources and the level of equity that producers would have to continue those additional feed purchases that would be required. If we have some sort of a spring and get some forage production, and then the drought is a little more typical in the sense of being a summer drought, that will provide some additional flexibility for producers. But again, the financial impacts are going to probably be an issue for many of these producers as we go through another year. The ability to extend their financial wherewithal to carry through much more of an extended drought will really be challenged as we move into the next year, and certainly those impacts will be around for several years. Next slide, please. Again, cattle numbers are going to be an issue. The backside of this thing, when we start thinking about rebuilding the cow herd, is that those limited numbers that are giving us high cattle prices and helping us salvage some equity now are going to be translated into very expensive costs for breeding animals when we try to rebuild cow herds in the region. So we're looking at very limited numbers. Let's go to the next slide. It will be, I think, a slow recovery. I think there will, realistically be limitations on the number of animals available to repopulate the herds in the region. If not physically, certainly economically there will be limitations, simply because the market will price them very, very high if there's a tremendous surge of demand at any one point in time for limited numbers of animals. So, many producers need to think about a somewhat more patient recovery strategy, I think. The good side of things, without going into detail, there are more opportunities in general for producers now to utilize a combination of cow-calf and stocker enterprises, or be those retained stockers or purchase stockers. There's somewhat more flexibility in the general marketplace now because of enhanced forage value for producers to take some time and decide really where they want to be ultimately in terms of the size of their cow herd, where they want to rebuild back to. And in fact, there's some longer term issues out there that we really don't have time to talk about right now that would suggest some producers may actually want to think about the extent to which they want to rebuild in terms of a cow-calf operation, and maybe think about permanently adjusting their mix of cattle production enterprises longer term. I think that's my last slide. I forgot to put a final contact information slide in here. I apologize for that. I'm not too hard to find. If anyone has any questions or would like any follow-up, I'd certainly be happy to visit with them.
Thank you. We'll now turn to New Mexico. Manny has been out dealing with the snow and taking care of the cattle there, so he's been working to try to find a good cell coverage and internet connection. So Manny, ready?
Yeah. Well, good morning, and thanks, Mark, for the invitation to participate. And yes, good morning from snow-blanketed New Mexico. It's definitely a mixed blessing of sorts. This morning I want to talk specifically on the impact of the drought on New Mexico calf operations, specifically related to the beef cow inventory in New Mexico and the challenges New Mexico producers are facing going into the winter. Next slide. This slide is some NASS data that outlines the beef cow inventory in New Mexico January 2011. And you can see that we started the year out with about 488,000 beef cows, which is the seventh lowest inventory in the last 26 years, and below the average inventory in the last 10 years. You can see that our 26-year average in New Mexico was about 531,000, and since we turned into the new century, our inventory has stayed below 500,000, and majority of this has been due to one big drought event at the turn of the century and lingering drought throughout the state since then. Next slide. To understand the impacts that the current drought has had on the beef cow inventory in New Mexico, I've been actively working with the New Mexico Livestock Board, who is the state agency that tracks the movements of beef cattle within the state and has the most accurate record of exports leaving the state to get a handle on this bigger issue of how many cows have actually left our state. This slide clearly outlines the New Mexico beef cow exports from January 1 to October 31st for both 2010 and 2011. And it's important to note that this data is for beef cows exported directly off of New Mexico ranches and does not include those beef cows that have went through New Mexico sale barns. The column there that says sold, those are actually cows that come off that were inspected off New Mexico ranches to be sold in out-of-state market. So you can see that in 2011 in New Mexico, go to the column that outlines total, we've actually exported over 62,000 mother cows out of New Mexico. And you can see the fractions, which went to pasture outside the state, which ones were sold, again, those outside out-of-state livestock auctions, and which ones were actually harvested. These numbers are very important to us as we begin to calculate how many cows, when this drought does break, will need to be replaced, and how that directly impacts our inventory. And you can see for 2011 that, just the cows that have left through October 31st, this translates into over 37,000 head. And interestingly, even though 2010 was not a year where we reduced a significant number of cows, combined 2010 and 2011 numbers, we've exported over 100,000 mother cows out of the state of New Mexico. Next slide. This is a really nice graph that, or a presentation of some different data for New Mexico beef cow exports when we look at it from a geographical perspective. Again, it's from January to October 2010 and 2011. If you were to blow this slide up, you could definitely look at it in more detail. But the big thing to notice in this slide is that 2/3 of all the cows that we've exported in 2011 came from the eastern side of the state, north to south, or the 9 easternmost brand districts. And this is the region that, when you look at the drought maps, has been hit hardest by the drought in 2011. And as a result, again, we've seen over 42,000 mother cows leave this region alone in 2011. Next slide. This cow herd inventory project, again, was stimulated by a conversation that actually Derrell Peel and I had in Canadian, Texas back in September. But it is an ongoing project. We've been fortunate enough to be working with the New Mexico Livestock Board on it. And we'll continue to update our numbers because this inventory data has direct and indirect impact not only to the industry, but also the infrastructure that supports the beef cattle industry in New Mexico, and definitely the rural economies that depend on our industry in New Mexico. Either way you look at it, again, we started the year at 488,000 mother cows. Just through October 31st, just removing those cows from this NAS inventory, we're likely to have an inventory that is going to be the lowest in the last 26 years when we start compiling the inspection data off New Mexico ranches. Through December, it's likely our inventory in New Mexico will fall under 400,000 head. I think, interestingly enough, the 62,000 head that we've lost through October is the single largest year-to-year decrease in our inventory since back in 2001 and 2002. So definitely a significant reduction in our herd numbers. As we move on beyond the inventory information that we went over and looked at some of the issues or challenges New Mexico beef cattle producers are facing going into the winter. Believe it or not, it did rain in parts of New Mexico. Unfortunately, the monsoons transpired a little later in the season, and it was definitely hotter than normal. And, what that typically translates to in our warm season native grass country is that there's not a whole, even though the rains come, it doesn't, they come late in the season, doesn't result in productive grass growth. And so even though we can drive out in these pastures and see a lot of deep head, there's not a lot of production out there for cows to winter on. So it means that our days on these pastures are limited. These rain events also did not produce adequate runoff to replenish dirt tank storage, which many ranchers depend on, similar to what Derrell was saying in Oklahoma. The other thing that was kind of interesting this year was because we are in a hay shortage, that value of the crop aftermath as a hay source has sort of crippled, I think, winter grazing options for a lot of cattle producers that depend on grazing such things as corn and milo stocks, and has definitely, again, decreased the number of days that producers have on in a grazing scenario and have had to rely on other means to get the energy into these cattle. For producers who take advantage of the option to ship the cattle out of state, well, I guess we'll see how this turns out. There's many producers that take advantage of this option. They'll have to create exodus of cattle to greener pastures. Again, around that 2001, 2002, I think for producers who sent their cattle out of state, mostly east, ultimately, this whole scenario did not turn out as good as they initially thought. But it definitely has been, this year specifically, been an excellent option for producers to retain their cow herd. But at what total cost, well, that's yet to be determined. Time will tell how it'll pencil out. I think cow production and survivability, especially in the northern climate, is likely to impact that whole equation, but we'll definitely keep our fingers crossed on this one. Next slide. I think back at the ranch, for those who've been able to hold on to their entire cow herd or even part of their cow herd, also have an interesting set of issues to contend with. I think for me personally, the best advice I can give to New Mexico producers is to truly understand the situation each operation is faced with. The thing about New Mexico is, we're a long way from a lot of the plentiful processed feed supplies that the producers like in Oklahoma and Texas have access to. There's, like Derrell said, there's a lot of money on the table that I think it can either go in your pocket or out the door. And I think for producers who are looking to stretch those days out in those pastures, I think it's important to understand that the cattle definitely are going to become energy deficient because they don't have the available grass, and they need to recognize that this is not a normal production year. In most normal production years, protein is what's deficient, and that's typically how producers supplement. So, we've been trying to get producers to understand that, turning the cake wagon on with a high percentage crude protein cake is not the solution to your keys, and your cows will definitely begin to show it things how energy is what is most efficient. I think a lot of what we've been doing for producers is trying to get some of these producers to understand that there's a lot of commodity-based types of feeds out there, specifically co-products that can help in decreasing their supplementation costs throughout the year. A lot of our producers in New Mexico are very traditional. They feed complete commercialized protein and or energy supplements, and definitely there's a price tag difference between those two, and that's one of the options that we've been trying to get producers to evaluate this year. Next slide. I think, again, that there's no doubt in New Mexico, just like any other place in the southern plains, we're in a hay shortage, and I think for those of us who've been on top of the hay situation, we realized that since the early part of the summer. It's surprising, however, that as you go across the state of New Mexico, and especially with this recent snow event that we've had, how surprised producers are at how short the supply is. It's not very surprising to see trucks coming into our part of the state from as far away as Manitoba, Canada. I personally brought in hay in the last few weeks from Wyoming, Nebraska, and Michigan. There is no local hay available today. Yes, we're paying a lot more for it. Again, those of us that have been in the loop have expected it. I think the biggest frustration, however, has been for most producers is that there are regional differences in how different regions and producers define their quality of hay. We're seeing a lot more non-traditional types of hay being fed to cattle out on the range and in confinement situations. I definitely urge producers that it's definitely a buyer beware. The price sounds too good to be true. You better look a little closer as to what you truly get. I think down the road, throughout the winter and into the spring, as we begin calving and most of the spring calving herds, we're likely to see the impact on cattle production. Cattle may not be doing as well on some of these traditional feeds because they've been brought from different regions of the country. And I think one of the things that we're trying to get into producers' mind is to be very conscious of where you're feeding this hay, mostly because a lot of this native grass hay that comes from other parts of the state is not weed-free, and we're a little concerned about the introduction of new weeds into New Mexico. The other issue we're facing in New Mexico is on the side of water. Again, that we're not plentiful supply on the surface perspective on the earth and reservoirs and dirt tanks. The quantity issue, but it's also a quality issue. Every time we get into these drier scenarios, we tend to see more cattle deaths related to water quality because of the higher mineral concentrations compared to years where we have adequate surface water. And so it's definitely important to understand just how good the water is at the surface when these dirt tanks and their supplies get low. Next slide. I think some of the major decisions for New Mexico cow-calf managers start thinking about is the cost of production. And there's a lot of money on the table, but I think the big question to ask and the honest question to ask yourself is how long can I afford to stay in? How long will I feed next year's calf crop and even the value of some of these valuable cows away by just trying to hold on? I think there is some opportunity, like Derrell said, even on the cow side of things. I don't think at this point, again, based on some information that Dave DuBois provided last week at our Joint Stockman's Convention in Albuquerque, begin exploring options on pasture outside of New Mexico. Before a lot of this colder weather set in, there were still options for producers to send cattle mostly north, and I think those are not unrealistic if producers are looking to hold on to their cows for the coming year. Also, I think down the road, producers need to begin to look at their marketing strategy for their what they do have left as far as the cow, or the majority of their calves have left. A lot of producers haven't preconditioned their calves as long. There's a lot of money on the table just for those freshly weaned calves. But right now, I think producers need to start looking at some options and opportunities to sell those high-value replacement heifers, and then getting down into the heart of the cow herd. I think one of the biggest things that we're beginning to realize in New Mexico as we put the numbers together is, we can definitely ship these cows north, and we can sell them out of state, but to be able to get the type of cow that fits our production environment is going to be a challenge once we begin to replace cows. And I think at best the supply will be short, and if the supply is short, they're definitely going to cost a lot more. But I think that's one of the most interesting scenarios that we're going to face as we begin to replenish the cow herd when the drought breaks. So thanks for your attention, and my contact information is on the next slide.
Thank you, Manny. And our last presenter on this is Eldon White, and Eldon is representing from the industry perspective in Texas. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate this opportunity to visit with you all a little bit this morning. I probably could sum everything up by saying everything that you've heard so far about the drought impact in Oklahoma and New Mexico is the same in Texas, only worse. Next slide. I'd like to start, though, by just giving a little bit of background about the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association. We were created in 1877, and this coming spring will be 135-year-old. We're the largest and oldest livestock association in Texas, and actually have members throughout the Southwest and I believe about 40 other states. We are currently at about 15,500 members that represent or manage about 4 million head of cattle and almost 80 million acres in Texas and Oklahoma primarily, but throughout the Southwest. Next. The impact of the drought in Texas has been severe, as it has been throughout the Southwest. We surveyed our members in September, and at that point in time found that 84% of them have reduced their herd size. and the average herd was reduced by an average of 38%. Now, these cattle were sold, moved out of state. According to the Texas Animal Health Commission, we've seen roughly 60,000 head of breeding cattle moved out of state this summer, and/or these cattle were harvested. And according to USDA figures, we've seen about a 20% increase in slaughter of cows in the region this year. We estimate through some figures given to us from AgriLife Extension that we are going to see about a 12 to 16% reduction in our total herd. Total herd size in Texas of beef cow herd is about 5,025,000 head, and we expect that will drop into the 4.5, 4.4 million head range. In auction sales, we also have seen a tremendous increase in movement. We inspect cattle at the auction markets through our association, and year to date we have inspected about 837,000 more cattle than a year ago. Next. The drought impact on agriculture in general, and then again this is Texas A&M University's AgriLife Extension figures, but on agriculture is about $5.2 billion. On livestock, which is primarily cattle in the state of Texas, $2.2 billion. Next. This is a decision map. I think the decisions that are made by producers in Texas are going to be identical to those in Oklahoma and New Mexico. We'll just go quickly through some slides, but next. In the spring of the year, of course, the producers are looking at information, try to estimate the prospects for the spring rain. Again, as been noted, we get the rain that we need primarily in April and May, and if it doesn't come, that means we're not going to have grass for the summer. And so the producers are beginning to formulate their plan on how they're going to stock their pastures, the pasture rotation, that sort of thing. Next. During summer, they begin to implement the plan, and this last summer what we have seen is that they weaned their calves at a much lighter weight. They saved the feed that the calf would have eaten, and then they also reduced the nutrition needs of the cow. So they were proactive in trying to mitigate the impact of the pending drought that they could see was developing in the state. They also extended their available pasture, fed hay or range cubes and other supplemental feed. They had more frequent pasture rotation, so they were careful not to overgraze. And they used their reserve pastures. Many of them set aside some land somewhere that they can always use in a drought. And then, of course, we saw more cattle on leased pasture within the state and, of course, outside the state. Next. They also began to reduce their herd size at that point in time and sold off the older and less productive cows. Began to sell off the lower quality genetic cattle. And someone told me that they sold off all the ornery cows, the ones that tried to kick you every time you went by them. They're the first ones to load on the truck. Next. In the fall, the period we've just come through, we saw many of our producers adjust their plans. The water supplies became very critical in many locations in the state. The cost of feeding, as has been noted, increased dramatically, and the distance to the available pasture on a rental basis also increased. We saw a good number of cattle that were shipped out of state or moved out of state go as far as Montana and South Dakota, which will, of course, increase their cost. Next. Now, by mid-September, we had a very critical decision point. We were looking at what the prospects were going to be for fall wheatgrass pasture. What were the rain prospects? Were we going to have enough warm weather to grow the wheatgrass? As noted in Dr. Peel's presentation, Oklahoma got some good moisture in the north central part of the state around Wichita Falls. We also received some good moisture suitable for growing of the wheatgrass pasture. They're also looking at the availability of and cost of hay for the winter. Again, it's been noted those costs have gone up dramatically. Next. So the real decision point was, should I continue to spend more money buying feed, or should I sell more or all of my cows? Next. As of December the 8th, today, we saw that some but limited wheatgrass pasture was available, so we saw some movement there. The climatologists are telling us that the La Nina is returning, and so the prospects for the winter are not looking good, and the prospects for spring rains next spring is really uncertain next. So essentially what I think we're seeing in Texas right now is the liquidation of the cattle herd is continuing. I think the January 1 figures that will come out from USDA will show that we are down more than the 12% that was predicted earlier, probably closer to the 16 or even higher percent liquidation. Next. Some lessons learned by the cattle raisers here in the state that you've got to manage your grass, hay, and money on a 10-year drought plan. The second thing that they've learned, that they've actually not learned new this time, but have always known, that you cannot feed yourself out of a drought. That single year drought will be felt for 2 to 3 years, and you've got to plan your resources, whether that's your money or grass or hay, accordingly. And that the resulting cattle herd that we are going to have will be a higher quality cattle herd when it relates to genetics. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have a lot gentler cattle herd. The final lesson learned, next, is that cattle raisers are survivors. And I think that's the important thing to know, is that particularly in the Southwest, cattle raisers have been through about everything they can be through, and they're still raising cattle, and they'll continue to raise cattle as long as they've got grass. So with that, I'm done at next, and but thank you all.
All right, I want to thank all of our presenters who showed the description of the cattle industry from the regional to the local levels, and note that there are a lot of optimists out there considering the extreme conditions that they've been facing. Lastly, we'll just wrap up with an update from some of our state climatologists. Barry Keim had wanted to talk about some changes in Louisiana. They're kind of on the eastern edge of this drought. They've been in and out of it, and we talked about Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas, New Mexico a lot, but it's also been affecting the western parts of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri as well.
Well, thanks, Mark. Since I'm standing between everybody and lunch, I'll make this very brief. But what I want to do is just give you just a summary of the drought and how it's evolved since late August. There's been quite a bit of change taking place in our neck of the woods. So next slide. Just to begin, I'm starting off here with August 30th, 2011. This is the drought monitor as depicted across the state of Louisiana. And leading up to this slide, very much like I've heard with some of the other folks, we had a very dry spring here in Louisiana, and summer was sketchy as well, although we did have a little bit of rain, but conditions had really deteriorated across the state, especially across western Louisiana, and across all that area, what we call D4, the area in the furthest westernmost part of the state, was tied in with the Texas drought as well as in Oklahoma and New Mexico. So things were really getting pretty bad here as well. And at this time, 86% of Louisiana was in severe drought or worse, with this gradient going from east to west with worsening conditions across the state. Next slide. However, going from October 30th to the next issue of the Drought Monitor on September the 6th, we had a very major event take place in Tropical Storm Lee, and that storm produced between 10 and 15 inches of rain across the eastern half of Louisiana. And as you can see, we had vast improvement across the state of Louisiana with drought removed from very much of the state. And the 1 week change went from 94% of the state in drought to only 44% of the state in drought 1 week later on September the 6th. Now, the problem we have is since then, we went right back into our arid pattern, and gradually things deteriorated. Next slide. So basically, week by week, what we've done with basically the National Drought Mitigation Center and the U.S. Drought Monitor folks we did what I call drought creep across the state of Louisiana, just gradually easing drought from west to east and leading up to this particular map that you see here. And with this gradual deterioration, by November 22nd, 99% of the state was then in drought. Give me the next one, and this is the last one. And this is the most recent issue. This came out this morning. Now, since Thanksgiving, we had several fronts move across this region that have produced at least some meaningful rains. Those meaningful rains mostly took place in the north and western portions of the state, but not so much in the southeast. So as a result, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen some improvement take place in the western half of the state, but down in the southeast, things continue to deteriorate. In fact, since last week, we've upped much of southeastern Louisiana, including the New Orleans metropolitan area, from D1 up to D2. So, while we are seeing some improvements in parts of the state, we're still deteriorating in others. So we still have some issues. And my hope is that what's taken place over the last couple of weeks is a sign of some change to come. But that would fly right in the face of what the Climate Prediction Center is forecasting for the next 3 months, which is this La Nina pattern of a warm and dry southern United States. So that's all I have for right now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you to Barry for those comments. And I know that there are other state climatologists who are online. I hadn't heard from many who wanted to make any comments, but I'll give a chance here if anybody wants to chime in.
Hi, this is John Nielsen Gammon from Texas. Of course, it's hard to summarize the whole state, but what we're dealing with basically is we get some decent rains this winter, or fall rather, is that people think, oh good, that's getting better, but of course we expect the soil moisture to increase over this period. We still haven't seen a month of above normal rainfall since January. So while the ground is starting to get moist in most parts of northern and central Texas, the reservoirs are still not happy, and the stream flows are not happy, and so we're keeping an eye on the hydrology right now in terms of a measure of how severe the drought is, because we need to build up reservoir levels this year, and that's not going to happen until we actually do have saturated soils so the water can run off better. So we passed the first step in coming out of a drought, but we've got several more steps to go. The long-range outlook doesn't look promising.
Thank you. And I guess the climatologists kind of try to counter that optimism that the ag industry folks tend to have. But those hydrologic issues have been an issue, because we've seen with some lakes refilling and more of the northern parts, especially eastern Oklahoma too. But just because we've had some rain, we've got a long way to go. So. I do not see any questions posted on the chat box, so I guess we'll wrap it up. I just wanted to let you know we'll leave this list up for a little bit here on the screen. Resources. Remind people that the presentation materials will be posted to the drought portal in the Southern Plains section. We will produce a 2-page PDF summary, as we have with the others, and that will be posted early next week. The webinar recording will be posted on the SCIP YouTube page, and the summary will also be on Facebook. So there's many ways to reach this. We will not have a webinar on December 22nd due to the holidays, so we'll return on January 12th with our next topic. And we'll look through the poll results from last week and this week and get topic lined up and get an announcement out soon. In addition, just reminding everybody that we'll be distributing a short survey to gather comments and ideas on how we can continue to improve these webinars and ensure that they're useful to you. When you receive the email, please complete the survey as soon as possible so that changes will be reflected in the January 12th webinar. Also, as always, we encourage you to continue to spread the word to make sure that all those dealing with aspects of this drought are part of the larger community and can access the support that they need. So if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to email us at SCIP. Margaret, who sends out the messages for the webinars, or myself. Contact your state climatologist. They're great resources, and they're always participating in here as well. And we hope everybody has a wonderful holiday season, and hope that some of this improvement we've seen in the last few months can continue in much larger regions of the state. So, our state. So have a great holiday season, everybody. We'll see you back in January.